Hey guys, welcome to A Nova Gaming. On this channel, I want to see what interesting things I can make by combining math and video games. I'm going to start out by making some videos about Hearthstone, but I might branch out to other games after that. So one of the first things that I wanted to do with Hearthstone was come up with a way to compare all the cards in the game and compare their strengths and weaknesses, regardless of what decks they fit in or what the meta looks like. I wanted a way to just compare how strong a card is by itself. So to do this, I wanted to try to give a value to as many things on each card as I could. So for minions, their attack and their health, and for other cards, values like how much damage they do or how much armor they give you. I wanted to try to give a value to each of those and evaluate how strong each card is on its own. I also decided to start with the basic and classic set to get a feel for what the power level was of the most basic cards in the game. But in order to compare all of these cards, I'm going to need to copy them into a spreadsheet so that I can compare their stats all at the same time. And so I downloaded all of the basic and classic cards into a spreadsheet. And it had the cost and attack and health of all of those cards, and it had the card text. And then I looked through that card text and looked for keywords like taunt and overload and charge and divine shield that I could turn into values to describe the card. I was specifically looking for attributes that were pretty common across a lot of different cards. And you can see all of the ones that I looked for across the top here. Along with cost and attack and health, I ended up with 14 different attributes that I was looking for in all of these cards. And because of what I was wanting to do next with these cards, I had to filter it down to just cards that could be described totally with these attributes. They didn't have any other card text except all of these attributes that I have listed out here. And I think I ended up with 92 cards that fit that criteria. And so next I had Excel do something called a regression, where it assigns a value or a cost to each of these attributes. So it comes up with a cost for attack, and it comes up with a cost for 1 point of health, and a cost for taunt, and a cost for 1 point of overload. And it is picking the cost for each of these attributes to try to make as many cards as possible line up as well as they can with their actual cost in game. And so after Excel did the regression, here are the costs that it came up with for each of those attributes. And so here are all the attributes that I used, and here are the costs that Excel came up with. And remember, these are the costs that Excel picked to make as many cards as possible line up with their actual in-game cost as it could. And these ones that I put up at the top here can only apply to minions, and then this larger group down here is kind of more generic, and it can apply to minions or spells or weapons. And so if we start with this 1 attack and 1 health up here at the top, I think it's pretty obvious that in the basic set that 1 attack and 1 health is worth 1 mana. But I was a little surprised that attack cost more on a minion than health did. So this means that in the classic set, cards with high attack values cost more than cards with high health values. That would mean that Bloodfin Raptor is actually a better card than River Crocolisk, which is kind of surprising because I feel like in a lot of situations I would rather have a River Crocolisk. But the balance of the cards in the classic set would say that the Bloodfin Raptor is better. This can also explain some cards like Magma Rager, which when you're playing the game end up being really bad. But just if you look at how much 5 points of attack is worth, this card actually looks really good. It's actually pretty much balanced for a 3-cost card. And so as we keep going down the list, we get to these keywords taunt, charge, and divine shield, and the costs that Excel came up with. And one of the interesting things is I went to look, and it didn't seem like these costs varied with the stats of the minion. So taunt didn't seem to cost more if the minion had a lot of health, and charge didn't seem to cost more if the minion had a high attack. These costs seem to be pretty consistent. One of the next ones I wanted to comment on was this drawing one card here that was costed at about 1.8 mana. This lines up with Arcane Intellect being a better card than Sprint, because the difference in their effects is drawing 2 cards, and the difference in their cost is 4 mana. But drawing 2 cards is only worth about 3.5 mana. This 1 damage, that was damage that you could point anywhere, so at minions or at the enemy hero. And that came in at about 1 mana, which some damage cards are more efficient than that, and some are less efficient than that, so this is about where the average ends up. Another interesting one is this give 1 attack and give 1 health. And they're actually costed really similarly to just playing a minion that has attack and health. And that kind of makes sense because there's both upsides and downsides to giving a minion stats. Because on the plus side, you can attack with that minion immediately, so it's kind of like those stats having charge. But on the downside, you have to actually control a minion that you want to give stats to, so it's a little bit less flexible. So I guess in the classic set, it actually ended up being balanced about the same, that giving a minion stats cost about the same amount as just playing a minion. And so next up we have the weapon stats. And the thing that really surprised me here was that weapon attack costs so much, almost as much as a point of direct damage that you can point anywhere. It really turned out that weapon attack was really expensive, and that durability was actually relatively cheap. Next up, we have 1 point of healing or armor, and this is specifically just healing or armor that is specifically for your hero. And that ended up costing just about 1/3 of a mana, which is actually really cheap. If you compare it to a point of damage, it's almost 1/3 the cost of a point of damage for a point of healing for your hero. Which makes sense because healing your hero is generally pretty unflexible and it doesn't help you get tempo on the board. But I was just surprised by how much cheaper this was than any of these other things in the classic set. So to go over these next two, 1 point of hero damage. This was damage that specifically damaged the enemy hero, which surprisingly, it was about half as expensive as 1 damage that you could use to damage anything. Which makes sense because you can't use this to fight for the board, but that was still kind of interesting. And then this is 1 point of damage that hits all enemy minions. So like Flame Strike and things like that. And so that ended up costing 2 mana for each point of damage that hit all enemy minions. And so that was pretty high, so that kind of surprised me. And down here at the bottom, we have the 2 negative numbers. And this first one that I have labeled the card itself, that's how much mana value you get from simply playing a card. For instance, if you play a 0 mana card, it doesn't do nothing. You get some effect just for spending a card. And so this is how much mana gets added to the cost of a card to make up for the fact that you're spending a card on it. An interesting thing is that when you compare this to some of the other costs, you realize that the classic set doesn't value this very highly. For instance, a 0 mana deal 1 damage would be overpowered, according to this. A 0 mana spell that gave a minion 1 attack would be exactly balanced, according to this. And so in the classic set, you did not get very much from just spending a card. So then at the very bottom here, we have Overload. And this is how much extra mana you get to tack onto a card because it has Overload on it. And it seems pretty fair that Overload would be costed at about -0.8. That means that Overload 2 means you get about 1.5 extra mana. And so it's probably pretty obvious that Blizzard didn't just pick a value for all these things and then just slap it on every card. They they purposely designed some cards to be a little stronger and some cards to be a little weaker. And so in a future video, I want to look at, even in these 92 most simple cards, what cards were the strongest and what cards were the weakest. And another thing I want to look at in the future is cards that I couldn't include here. So for instance, cards with conditions like combo instead of battle cry. I want to look at how much extra value Blizzard would put on a card because it had combo instead of battle cry. Or how much value they took away from a card because it had something like choose one on it.